When I started using watercolor pencils, it seemed obvious I needed the best watercolor papers in order to get the best results, but I kept wondering if this was really the case. Since painting with watercolor pencils is not like using traditional watercolors, and there's a lot less water involved in my experience. I want to thank one of you here, Steven, for suggesting the idea in the comments from a recent video and reminding me I should be trying this. And I can tell you now for sure that paper can change everything, from your experience with watercolor pencils to what a painting actually looks like. I'm going to compare 4 types of papers and how they do with the Faber-Castell Eyebrush watercolor pencils. I'm picking these because they are great pencils, they blend well, and they're pigmented among other qualities, so I know they won't interfere with the experiment. The first paper I've picked is a 100% cotton drawing paper that's great with pencils and ink. I had bought it for colored pencils, and it's not one you would use with watercolors or even hear about in this industry. I'm thinking watercolor pencils are so similar to colored pencils, the results could be pretty surprising, and that's why we're going to test it. The second paper is my all-time favorite that I already used with watercolor pencils. It's the Arches 100% cotton paper, cold press, and the weight is 300 grams per square meter, so quite thick. I want to know if I should be using hot press paper instead, because its texture is much smoother than cold press, so it might be better for watercolor in pencil form. So I added the same Arches paper, same weight, and also a 100% cotton but hot press. And I need to add that I never use hot press paper with watercolors because I think it dries too fast. It doesn't handle water that well. And finally, for everyone that has been practicing with a more affordable kind of watercolor paper, I added a cellulose paper. No cotton there. This kind absorbs water less well than the 100% cotton watercolor papers, but the question is, do we really need 100% cotton papers for watercolor pencils? And what I like is the texture of this one. It's cold press, but not as grainy as my Arches paper, so it could be the perfect match for watercolor pencils despite being the cheapest of the bunch. I'm excited because of all the what ifs here, and before filming I had no clue about what I was going to find out. The Strathmore drawing paper feels great, I think, with any pencil. It's smooth enough, but with a little tooth still for pigment to grip on the surface better. And I'm enjoying the meditative process of coloring on there. It really makes me want to use colored pencils again. I'm just a bit worried about how it will activate if the paper even takes the water that well, since it's going to lack the sizing watercolor papers come with. And for now, colors are looking light, but I'm confident I'll be able to add shadows with a second layer because I know it's great quality. Arches cold press watercolor paper is the one I've always or mostly used with watercolor pencils because for me it's the best of the best. I really like it for watercolor painting in general. The thing I don't love with watercolor pencils, however, and using Strathmore right before enhances this, is that the surface feels much scratchier because it's grainy mostly. So at first glance, the coloring looks approximate compared to Strathmore. But, and that's important, it is much faster to color. Pigment gets deposited easily, and I know already that when I activate this, all the white specks that you see will get filled up with paint, so there shouldn't be any issues. And I must admit that when I reflect on the time it took me to just color on Strathmore, aside from my perfectionism and enjoying it, it makes me question the point of drawing paper if it's going to take that much longer. Might as well just work with colored pencils then, but we'll see. I can see a slight difference in the outcome, the vibrancy, from the two papers. And yet I'm using the same colors, same techniques. But maybe it's just because there's more pigment on the drawing paper than there is on Arches cold press. With Arches hot press paper this time, a much smoother texture, similar to Strathmore drawing paper. Again, the coloring takes longer. And I'm not sure if it's because I'm getting more daring or just the leads are not that sharp anymore, but I find it's a lot faster than coloring on the drawing paper, but still noticeably slower than the cold press watercolor paper. And I think with watercolor pencil, you don't need to color as carefully as with colored pencils, since the pigment gets activated, so I'm guessing I'll be okay. And again, you can tell how smoother surfaces show the most detail with the coloring, which isn't really surprising. This paper is a French affordable cellulose paper. A lot of people use this kind when they start watercolor. I know it's okay, not awesome, because it's not 100% cotton, but it's still decent in a painting. It's cold press and it has a texture, so coloring on there is fast like Arches cold press. I thought I might like the texture, but I actually don't like the looks the surface is giving my drawing because the grain seems more spread out, and I hope it won't show when we activate the paint. For now, I've used brown as a way to place the first shadows, but in a subtle way, and it's funny how colors don't all look the same on all 4 papers. Now we need to activate the pigment, see how colors blend into each other, and what this is actually going to look like. With the Strathmore drawing paper, I can tell it's not cotton. The pigment moves around in clumps, so it's not really easy to blend, but it's decent. It's the kind of paper with which you better clean a paintbrush frequently, and I suspect it will take some getting used to get a good painting with watercolor pencils in there, but I think it's doable. With Arches cold press, the pencil lines stay visible even after blending, and because of that, it doesn't look as nice, and I thought it would compare to Stonehenge. I'm a bit surprised, but then this is only the first layer. The good thing is I can clearly feel the absorbency level is so much better. I'm not getting near as much of that effect of clumps of pigment moving around with my brush strokes. Arches hot press right now feels like the perfect go-between after activating paint on Stonehenge drawing paper and then Arches cold press paper. It's smooth enough that there are hardly any pencil lines showing. I didn't even take as much care as I did on Strathmore when I was coloring on this paper. And I also like that the absorbency levels are similar to Arches cold press. With this Monani cold press cellulose paper, I really don't like the texture. It's really see-through for me. I really prefer a smooth look, but if you enjoy texture, then I guess it wouldn't be shocking. I also find the colors look so-so on there. For now, we're not near done yet, but I prefer Arches hot press watercolor paper overall. It has all the qualities of all of the papers combined and no major flaw, and I'm surprised so far because I usually go for cold press paper. If you're familiar with my watercolor pencil videos, you might have noticed I always add a second layer to my paintings to add more contrast and realism. Like I was expecting with a Stonehenge drawing paper, I can layer again pretty well. I'm adding indigo this time to increase the shadows dramatically. I'm going to blend this right away, and I'm actually curious to see what this looks like. And it's hard to blend, even more now that I have a dark color in there. Those clumps of color make it difficult to make the painting look pretty with the second layer. And if I linger a second too long in one area, the paint tends to lift off the paper, and I can't touch that up anymore. I'm going to relayer on dry and keep it as colored pencil work, but I'm thinking I really don't see the point. Maybe to use watercolor pencil as a fast way to start a colored pencil piece of art? With Arches cold press watercolor paper, no surprise, it's easy to layer too, and so much faster. The blending is easy and it really makes the second layer look effective already, and the pencil lines aren't visible much anymore. At this point, this painting would need just minimal additional touches. To push this experiment far, I still want to add a third layer since I did it when I colored over my second layer with a Strathmore paper. It's tempting to activate this again because of all the pencil lines, so now this is our official third layer, and I like I can add detail on the cherries, so it was a good idea to push it so far. Now I feel like I need to do the exact same process on Strathmore, so let's activate that too. The color still lifts off the paper too easily. It's really hard to get something consistent, but shadows and dark parts look better now. With Arches hot press paper, similar experience to Arches cold press with maybe a bit less control over producing a smooth blending, but I think this comes down to learning how to master the technique on that specific kind of paper, and I'm already getting a better feel for it. It's not the paper I've been using so far, and it really makes me wonder if I should do more with it because the painting looks pretty good. With the Monani cellulose watercolor paper, the texture really isn't great and color doesn't stick well, just like on Strathmore paper kind of. That's where you see the limits of cellulose watercolor papers. Watercolor pencils not looking awesome on a paper seems to have to do more with the absorbency levels of the paper than the tooth itself, I mean the grain of the paper. Not to say cellulose watercolor papers are similar to simple drawing papers, but they really aren't that great with water if you like to control the outcome of a painting and make it smooth and realistic like I do. You can't spend too much time in one spot and it feels really limiting. So far, you can see what the paintings look like on all 4 papers. If we're going to decide what paper gives the best results with watercolor pencil works that look smooth and realistic, then I need to work on those paintings some more. I want to add the shadows now and then the highlights to see what comes out on top. And I encourage you to stay with me till I peel the tape off of these papers because it's going to be good and I'll have some final impressions to share about each paper. It's hard to layer again on Strathmore, but I manage and it's doing the trick of deepening the shadows. I'm going to add more color now on top of that to add vibrancy and improve gradients between what's dark and what's lighter and brighter. And this time I'm not going to activate the paint. The cherries show some texture, some dots, so I'm going to use a great watercolor pencil technique that allows to splatter paint. With a white pencil now, I wet the lead and I can add subtle highlights. And finally, with a white watercolor stick, I can add stronger highlights, and I'm going to repeat this process on the other paintings. I'd love to know at the end of the video what version you find is the nicest, and for now, let's keep experimenting. Strathmore takes more work, more time coloring overall, but you can get a very decent result, and I believe it will be much quicker than using colored pencils only. When I add the finishing touches on ash cold press, I'm running into the same issue of pencil lines showing on this kind of slightly grainy texture. And that means I'll always have to blend any addition I'm going to add on there. So here we go for our 4th layer, which you would very rarely see me do when I paint. But I guess here we have very dark parts to emphasize, and I also want the art to look great and stretch the experiment to make it more in-depth. I'm also noticing how after this many layers, I'm still not having the level of control I'd like, unfortunately. Visually speaking though, I think it looks great. With Ash Hot Press, the problems I mentioned before are all solved, so I'm having fun here. It's funny because I actually tried that hot press once before for a Skillshare class I'd done on watercolor pencils, and that turned out beautiful on cold press paper. I'll add the link to that in the description. But I think I didn't get the results I'm getting now with hot press because I didn't have as much practice then with the blending. So you see, it's not just about taste, but also your experience of the medium. And I think when you feel comfortable blending watercolor pencil, when your skills improve, hot press could be a complete asset to your practice. And I have the feeling this is the case for me. And I'm also thinking that depending on the pencils that you use, hot press might not be the best. Like if those pencils are cheaper and the pigment doesn't come out of them very easy, then it probably would be better to have a grainy surface they can grip on better, like cold press. Now let's see how this cellulose paper is doing. Like ash cold press, the texture makes it very hard to just add to the paper without needing to use water afterwards. Every pencil stroke shows. And I also find that out of the bunch, the colors are really pale and boring no matter what I do. And even though I can make it look decent, I can change my mind about cheaper papers affecting the way art feels and looks. It's less fun and less nice visually. But again, these more affordable options are great for beginners or anyone who isn't sure whether they want to learn more about a certain medium or not. Look at that shine on the Strathmore drawing paper version. I wasn't expecting that. I totally encourage you to try several papers like I did here to see which one will benefit you and your style in the best possible way. Overall, I would point you towards 100% cotton watercolor papers, cold press, or hot press. For more, you can check out this playlist about watercolor and water-soluble pencils. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I loved making it. I'll see you in the next one.